Um, my name is Stephen Sprigle, as you can see. I work at Georgia Institute of Technology. I'm a professor there. And we do a variety of things. I teach, so I'm sort of a real professor guy, because I actually grade papers and stuff, and that's pretty fun. And, but also run a research lab. It's called the Rehab Engineering and Applied Research Lab. And that's the logo we designed when we went to a bar one afternoon. And that was pretty fun, I think, but we kept it for that reason. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about how you'd make decisions that impact sort of propulsion torque. And hopefully we're going to sort of explain this in a variety of ways to cover different stuff. Now, I always say I'm a professor because that leads me into a few things. One, you should feel free to ask questions. That will make you completely different than my students who never ask questions. You also should feel free of opening up your Facebook. And then you will act exactly like my students. Yeah. So, the objective of this talk is sort of explain the inertial and frictional influences on propulsion torque. Okay, so propulsion torque is what we measure to sort of generate effort. Torque is what you apply to the wheels. And inertia and friction we're going to talk about. But I have a secondary objective, okay? So my secondary objective is to assess the accuracy of this grant reviewer's comment. So I got a D. I got a D on this proposal. I don't like getting Ds. I don't like giving Ds, and I don't like getting Ds. But I'm a biased person here, and what this grant reviewer says is this proposal is worthless because everything you're going to tell me is intuitive because you're just studying the chair, okay? And that's all we were studying is the chair, full disclosure. So that's our secondary objectives. We'll see how we do here. In order to sort of understand why you measure propulsion torque and effort, you sort of have to look at how people use wheelchairs. And this is always sort of interesting data. And some of this has been sort of detailed a little more clearly and will be presented by Ben Mortensen in a talk, or already happened. Unfortunately, I lose my schedule a lot. There's a lot of data that sort of tracked how far people move, what their average velocity is. And there's a few interesting things about this table. One line covers athletes, okay? So we can move them because they're athletes, right? And so if you take that athlete line out, you look at the other bit of data, you see a huge commonality with different cohorts, different geographical regions, that folks are really moving about 1.5, maybe 2 kilometers per day. Okay, that's it, okay? Well, that's about 20% of what the average American walks per day. And it's actually about 25% of what an average American walks per day, and about 20% of what the average adult worldwide walks, because Americans walk less worldwide than everybody else, okay? So this clearly sort of says there's a mobility disability in this cohort. Okay, that people in manual wheelchairs don't move as far as people. The other thing to look at is the speeds, okay? So you're talking about average speeds on the order of the majority, once again, you can take athletes out, sort of 0.4 to 0.6 meters per second. And so that's right around 1 mile an hour-ish, okay? And that's exactly the same speed as the average working adult walks about during a day. Is about 0.5 meters per second throughout the day. Now, how much people use wheelchairs is different than how they use wheelchairs. And this is an important question because it motivates sort of how you study wheelchairs, and that's what we were interested in. So as you saw, you know, the distance and the time moving is fairly commonly described. There are also two things that are highly correlated. And anything that's highly correlated means that they don't offer unique information. You can measure one or the other, and they're highly correlated, and you can infer the other one. We looked at bouts of movement. So bouts of movement are defined as sort of the transition between activities, okay? Now, you just were doing bouts of movement that were long duration almost, broken up, right? You would go to a booth, and you would maybe stand there and mill about and learn a little bit, and then you'd convey yourself, you'd walk to another booth. That's a bout of movement, okay? If you were, you know, if you were at the table outside, you got up and came in here, that's a bout of movement. And so we started measuring those, okay? So if you look at this data, this is on 70 people, all full-time wheelchair users, all using the same ultra-lightweight classification of a wheelchair, okay? And we measured about 60,000 bouts of movement over about 560 some odd subject days, okay? And now you take a look at this. The number of bouts, remember a bout is a start and a stop and pushing in between. That the average person did 90 starts and 90 stops, but you can see the range of this. You know, there was one person who was up at 280 bouts of mobility, okay? And the distance wheeled is about 1.7. The other thing you notice is I put up mean and median because in a skewed distribution, it's good to show both because anytime you have outliers like 281 bouts, 10.5 kilometers, it drags the mean up, okay? So when you do mean income in the United States, you know, Bill Gates sort of drags that mean up, okay? And then once again, you see this time wheeling is a little under an hour, but there was somebody who went 208 minutes that a day, right? So this is the daily activity. But it's more interesting to look at the bout descriptions, okay? So this is how far people go in a bout, how long those bouts last, and at what speed. And if you notice, you look, here's the 25 and 50th and the 75th percentile, bouts are very short, right? And the 75th distance of a bout is only about 18 meters or so. The interesting thing is in the duration. About 84% of all mobility bouts are less than 60 seconds. About 80% of walking bouts are less than 60 seconds. About 85% of power mobility bouts are less than 60 seconds. So what we saw is a mobility disability, but people in manual wheelchairs move about in the same way as people who walk and people in power chairs. This underscores the use as a functional device. We move about in a functional manner that is basically in short bursts of activity, whether we walk, use a joystick, or push. So let's take a look at this data, long bouts. Okay, so we chose 5 minutes. Why did we choose 5 minutes? Because, I don't know why, because only 1% of bouts were 5 minutes long. So maybe it wasn't a good choice, right? Only 344 out of the 60,000 of bouts lasted 5 minutes or longer. And 15 of these subjects dominated that. So 15 of these 70 people accounted for 80% of these bouts. They use chairs differently than the other folks. Is that a surprise? No, it's not a surprise. I mean, y'all, you know, there's somebody here who uses their car differently than I use my car. There's people who use their shoes differently than I use my shoes. So, but it sort of does show that long bouts of mobility are rare. 99% of them are shorter than 5 minutes. How about fast bouts? 1 meter per second, okay? Only 3% of bouts exceeded that threshold, okay? But every subject had at least one fast bout. Everybody went at least 1 meter per second one time during that week of monitoring, okay? And 40 subjects, over half, had over 10 of those fast bouts. So you see speed occurs much more than duration, okay? Well, this motivates a few things. From a research perspective, it sort of says that there's a huge variance of wheelchair use. So it's hard to say this is a normal wheelchair user or an average wheelchair user. There is no normal or average wheelchair user. We also documented this depressed mobility, okay? That should be a goal of ours. Let's get mobility up until other cohorts of maybe of folks that walk, okay? Short bursts of movement dominate this activity, okay? And that's the interesting thing is wheelchair users move about in about the same way as ambulators do, okay? This raises a question of how to study efficiency, right? Do you have people propel at a self-selected speed, or do you have them propel at a typical everyday speed? Because your efficiency is going to be different then. And do you have them go in a steady state manner, or do you have them maneuver, embodied by starts, stops, and turns? Those are critical research questions that dictate what you can say about your outcomes. Finally, it complicates the definition of dose of use. So anytime you're thinking about trying to say how much people use chairs, you can't say, oh, how long have they been using a chair? You can't even say how much time do they spend a chair a day, because dosage varies independent of those two things. And that makes researcher a little harder, but not impossible. We measure dosage all the time. You just can't use the easier measures. But the clinical perspective is what you're here for. And I would argue that there's a couple. One, the clinical perspective is the short game. Wheelchair users need to deal with the short game, okay? And starting and stopping and turning embodies maneuvering. And so that's your functional consideration, and that's what you have to take into account in prescription, is how well folks maneuver their chairs. That should be your dominating criteria. Then, because maneuvering involves changes in momentum, it's impacted by friction and inertia. And you have almost total control over both those factors and how you balance and equate them. And that's the battle we're going to fight today. So, friction is the resistance of motion of two bodies in contact, okay? And there's an important thing that's in this statement, bodies in contact. And so you can't ever say, so what are the friction of your shoes? Because you have to say, on a basketball court. Or, what is the friction of this wheelchair tire? And then you always have to say on carpet or on a sidewalk. You need that interface to define friction. Inertia is different. Inertia is inherent to the system. Remember you all heard as a kid, oh, you have the same mass here as you have on the moon, but you weigh less. Well, that's true because mass is inherent to your body, right? It's a measure of inertia. It's a resistance due to resistance to motion due to mass, okay? And you're used to rectilinear inertia. Rectilinear inertia is your body mass and how you move straight, okay? In terms of wheelchairs, right, you have air drag and bearings, you have rolling resistance, you have tire scrub, and you have alignment, all sort of conspire into frictional energy loss, because that's what friction is. It's a loss of energy. Inertia is sort of embodied by the total mass of the system and the distribution of that mass, okay? And you've all seen that, okay? Who can do more flips off a diving board? Somebody in a tucked position or somebody in a piked position, right? It's the tucked position. Ice skaters, do they go fast when they pull in or do they go fast when they slow down? That's a bar trick, right? Spinning around on a bar stool, raise your arms and slow down, bring them in and go fast, fall off. It's priceless, right? And it's just a representation of inertia. But you also have the rotational inertia of the wheels, and that's something that's been understudied for a bit, and we're starting to take that into consideration, and you might have done that. That's what a gyroscope is, right? When a wheel starts to go, it doesn't like to precess, it keeps that straight line, and that's why you can really ride your bike with no hands, because this has enough rotational inertia that it keeps you going in a nice straight path. Okay, so if you think about a wheelchair motion, right? Moving a wheelchair is about imparting kinetic energy into this system, right? You have a stop system and you're imparting energy into it. That's what you always have to do when you walk or drive or anything, imparting kinetic energy. And so this is the equation of kinetic energy. And I put it up because Greek letters are fun, but I wanted you just to look at one thing in terms of the equation. You've all seen the equation 1/2 mv squared, every one of you, because you did it in middle school. You know, my girls did it in middle school, and believe me, they hate science as bad as any vegetable. Yeah, so I got that going for me. So 1/2 mv squared has a measure of inertia, mass, and it has square velocity. Well, every other term up there also has a measure of inertia and the square of a velocity. But sometimes it's the velocity of a wheel or a caster. Sometimes it's the velocity of the system turning. But all those components are the same. And that allows us to partition kinetic energy into 3 parts. Translation, 1/2 mv squared when you're going straight and forward, translating, right? You have turning inertia, the inertia it takes to turn this body on the yaw axis, yaw inertia, okay? And then you have a couple times of rotational inertia, right? You have the drive wheel spinning, and you have casters spinning. That all encompasses rotational inertia. So if you think of these 3 measures of inertia, what we do when we go just purely straight is we only have 2 of them. What we do when we maneuver is you have to impart energy in all 3 manners. And imparting energy takes work. Okay? So let's just look at inertial mass, right? It's pretty intuitive, to steal a word, that the mass of the system is dominated by the occupant. Okay, so here are mass of 2 chairs out of the box, right? So we got a Aero Z from Tylite, it's 12.1 kg, and we got a tracer that's 17.6 kg. Well, you load it with a 75 kg person, and you can see that the difference starts to plummet. Okay, and this is an important consideration because remember, there's an inertial measurement in everything about imparting energy. Okay, same with wheels. Okay, wheels have mass, but wheels also have rotational inertia, okay? And so here's a solid mag tire that we got off of the tracer. Here's a spoke pneumatic tire that we got off the stock off the Tylite. And then we have a Spinergy low inertia wheel. And you can see there's a little difference in mass. But that's not the only thing you need to look at when you look at performance of a wheel. You have to look at that other column, that little rotational inertia column, because that has to do with how much inertia it has when it's spinning on its axle. And once again, you can sort of see the differences. And a mag wheel, you know, typically does have much greater mass. And that mass is distributed in a way that it actually has a decent amount of rotational inertia. But you can sort of see the percent differences that compared to the Spinergy, which is a low weight, low rotational inertia system, the stock pneumatic spoke is under about 10% difference in both those categories, but the tracer is hugely different, okay? And so imparting energy, making that tracer rotate those wheels takes a lot more work, in other words. So this is kinetic energy in 6 pushes as fast as you can go, okay? And this kinetic energy is shown partitioned as well as in total, okay? And the first thing that you should notice is a lot of these little cycles follow each other. Well, the top one is velocity, okay? And velocity is on the right-hand side, and then the left-hand side is in joules. Well, joules is a pretty cool measurement because it's the measurement of energy as well as the measurement of work. And so you measure work and energy in the same type of units, and whenever you change energy, that's how much work you've done. That's the definition of work, right? The definition of work is changing system energy, okay? And remember, that's what wheelchair users do. It's all they do when they push around, okay? So let's take a look at these 6 strokes, okay? So the very first thing that you do when you push is accelerate this mass and impart kinetic energy into the system. And you can see that there's a line right under that. Well, that's the translational kinetic energy. It's dominating the total system energy. And then this sort of green line down is sort of this humpy thing is rotational kinetic energy, right? These are the wheels. So when you push from a stop, you have to impart this much energy, almost 20 joules of energy from a stop, okay? And then your wheels are going, and this is your turning energy, right? Well, this is a straight turn. There is no turning energy. It's not involved at all, okay? But then what happens? You lose energy. And this is the problem with wheelchair propulsion. It's highly inefficient because every time you do work into the system, there's this moment of time when it gets sucked out of you and taken away. And this is resistive energy loss. Okay, this is what happens when you release your hand from the hand rim because no torque can be applied and you slow down. Okay? Both these things are important in terms of effort, okay? Because then what you have to do is re-accelerate the system in your second stroke and re-accelerate it in the third and in the fourth, right? And you can also see that the amount of energy you put into the system goes down with each stroke until you reach a maximum velocity, and then you start to slow down, right? Because you can only sustain a maximum velocity for so long. And that's the same with sprinting, right? You know, I mean, Usain Bolt can only go so fast for so long, and then he's going to slow down. So you can see the most energy we put into the system is from stop to that first stroke. And remember that because that's become exceedingly important to the effort it takes to propel a chair from a human's perspective. Now let's look at a slalom, okay? So here's the slalom course. You start, you go around a pylon that's 2.5 meters, another 2.5 meters, and then it's 2 meters apart, and then 1.5 meters apart, and then it goes down to 1 meter apart, and then you sprint to the back, right? So this is a slalom. Okay, so what do you see? You see them sprinting, getting a decent amount of velocity, and then as the pylons get closer and closer, they have to slow down because they have to maneuver, right? You can't fly through a slalom course. And then the velocity goes down and the energy goes down. But let's look at the contributions of this energy, right? You still see total energy and translational energy dominating that partition. But now you start seeing turning, right? This was a sharp turn here. And this is what happens when you almost overrun the pylon. And then you have rotational energy as well. So everything contributes to the effort it takes to propel a chair. You're imparting energy in 3 ways. And so it's not just going straight. It's a more complex thing than that, okay? The other thing to notice is how jagged this is. This is going straight. This is going in a slalom. Why is it so jagged? Is this the drunken walk, huh? You are changing direction. And how are you changing direction? You're not accelerating constantly going in a thing. Yeah. Yeah. So the weird thing about turning, again, what makes wheelchair things inefficiently, is you're accelerating one side of your chair while you're slowing down the other, okay? How wise is that? That's another thing that makes propelling a wheelchair highly inefficient, but what we don't study when we don't turn, right? You know, if you're going to study this maneuverability, you have to take this inefficiency where you're applying torque on one side and taking, you know, and slowing it down on the other. That's why it's so jagged, because you're propelling and braking at the same time to maneuver. Okay, that's effortful. It requires effort to do that. Okay, but it's important to consider because it's a unique way. You know, you don't slam on your brakes every time you turn in your bike or drag your foot, you know, to turn and accelerate around a thing. But that's what makes a chair maneuverable. You can't do that with a tiller. You won't get as tight a turn. Okay? So now let's go to friction, because that, braking one side, is a frictional energy loss. Okay? So you've sort of seen a very traditional rolling resistant, straight, free body diagram. You've never called it a free body diagram, but now you have, okay? So what you have is rolling resistance, which is really friction on the wheels as it rolls on a surface, right? Now, you say, wow, I wish we could get rid of friction. Well, that's what happens on ice, getting rid of friction. okay? So you can't get rid of friction, right? Deal with it, okay? But this has to do with retarding forces at the casters and the drive wheels as you go forward, right? Now, turning adds a much more different forces, right? And this is what we study because it's a lot easier to study this. This is tougher, okay? And I know this red dot is highly useful to all of you because I can barely see it. And I'm inches away compared to you, right? So this is a fixed wheel turn, right? So what you do is you sort of lock this wheel right here and you rotate around the wheel. That's a fixed wheel turn, right? And there's a lot of ways to do a turn. This is one way. And if you think about it, you know, a turn is embodied by sort of the radius of curvature of a turn, right? And people will say, well, why do you use this tight of a turn? And I go, well, what kind of turn do you want? Because there's only one instance where the radius of turning is infinite, and that's going straight. And then everything else is a turn. So basically, we're turning way more often than we're going straight because there's only one instance of straight and everything else is a turn. But this is a tight turn, no doubt about it. So what happens, right, is the casters align to the radius of curvature at the wheel, and then they have rolling resistance to it. The wheels, as they're rolling, have rolling resistance to it. And then you see these little circles here. Well, these circles here are how we indicate torque around an axis of rotation, and we use yet another Greek letter right here, right? So you have resistance to turning, rolling resistance, rolling resistance, rolling resistance, rolling resistance. So you've got a lot of stuff going on, okay? This is a very complex system, but one that's been understudied, but one that you have to reflect on, because everybody you put in a chair turns. So what do we know? We know a lot of stuff that y'all have to remember, right? We know that pneumatic tires have a little bit of suspension in them. They offer a softer ride, okay? Now that can come at a cost, right? It can dampen the system and you can have energy loss, but they also require maintenance. Because you know what's bad about pneumatic tires? Flat pneumatic tires. That's what's bad about them, right? Now, solid tires give a harder ride, okay? But they're pretty much maintenance free and they will outlast the wheelchair. There's no two ways about it. These things are pretty brutal, okay? So this sets up an interesting trade-off, right? Design is a series of compromises. And just in tires, you have a compromise to make, okay? Do I want a softer ride that requires maintenance and has other values, or I want a solid tire that never requires maintenance and has some baggage to it there too, okay? We also know that wider tires have increased rolling resistance than narrower tires. But if you're gonna go over sand, you need a wider tire. So that's a trade-off, right? It's not good or bad, it's a compromise. And that's sort of the theory for the day, okay? We also know that the profile and the tread impact friction, okay? And what we're gonna see is that profile impacts rolling resistance, okay? Axle position does two things, mechanically, and several things biomechanically, okay? And what we've been accustomed to a lot is talking about the biomechanical influence of axle position, okay? And y'all are well aware of this, okay? What I wanted to show you is how long ago we told this. This is a picture from when I was in graduate school. And if you read this article, you will see a graduate student popping a wheelie, unbeknownst, who had his photograph taken and it was put in an article without his permission. And the first time he saw that picture was when he read the article. Won't point fingers, but my advisor did that to me, yes. Some kind of hazing ritual, yeah. So this is Dr. Brubaker's figures. Actually, I think Sam McFarland might have drawn these. But this is back in 1990, I think this came out. This is a VA supplement on wheelchairs in 1990 when I was a student. And so it's the well-known sort of configuration thing. You move the axle forward, you change the access to the hand rims. That puts you in a biomechanically better position. to apply torque via shoulder flexion and shoulder adduction, right? It gives you an opportunity to put a bigger piece of the pie on the hand rim, because the only time you're putting torque into the chair is when your hand's on the rim going forward, right? If you don't have your hand on the rim, you're doing nothing but slowing down, okay? So we've done this 25 years ago, right? So 25 years, we've sort of been doing that, and you all have done a good job of sort of doing it. Now let's look at the mechanical influences, right? There's a huge mechanical benefit of reducing the footprint of the chair. You can now turn in a smaller space. You now can go from a hallway into a bathroom much easier. You can negotiate smaller spaces because your base of support is smaller, okay? It also reduces turning inertia, because inertia has to do with the distribution of mass around your center of gravity, okay? So if you reduce the size of this thing, the distance in mass from this center of gravity is reduced, and it's easier to turn. That's a good thing. It's the same thing with the diver, same thing with the ice skater, okay? However, you can tip over on your head, okay? That's because stability is defined by your center of mass being within your base of support, period. And if your center of mass exceeds your base of support, it's an unstable situation, you're going down, okay? And in a wheelie, that's what you sort of do. You use your head, and you're bopping because you're bopping over. It's not static stability, a wheelie. That's dynamic stability in a wheelie. Now, weight distribution is also affected by axle placement, okay? Anytime you change the mass on wheels, you change the friction of those wheels on the surface, because friction is directly related to the normal force of the object on the surface, period, right? You can't get away from that. That's life, okay? So if you look at sort of standard chair setups, they're about 55 or 60%, okay? These are highly stable chairs. It's really hard to pop a wheelie on a chair that has 55% of the weight on the drive wheels and 45% on the casters. You got to come up pretty far to pop a wheelie, okay? And that's probably why they're that way, okay? They want that stability. Active chairs can go from about 75 all the way to 80 plus. You know, you see 85, you see 84. This is a very drive wheel dominated loading, right? And so it's gonna change the frictional parameters. We also know that rolling resistance is inversely proportional to the wheel diameter, okay? You'll never see somebody in the Tour de France pedaling the little circus bikes with little dinky wheels, because they will lose, okay? Bigger tires have a benefit of that. So we have a conflict there. It's a design compromise, right? We're loading the bigger wheels by moving the axle forward, but the bigger wheels can handle the more load because it can handle more friction, okay? But which wins? Do they cancel out when moving the axle forward? Do we add friction when we move the axle forward and overload the drive wheels? What's going on? You know, where is this sweet spot of sort of crossing? There's only one way to find out. Tests, okay? So here's graduate student Ray doing a coast down test. Coast down tests are not that big a deal. We do it a little differently, is that we monitor velocity of the wheel. So we either have an accelerometer and encoder on the hub, we can measure the velocity of the wheel, we pull that velocity out, and then we can measure deceleration, okay? In a straight, you're just pushing it straight and letting it roll down. But then we wanted to start to measure scrub. And to measure scrub, you have to be able to turn it. To be able to turn it, you have to do something special. You have to restrict the tangential motion of this. As you can see, we lock one wheel, we rotate around, let it go, and let it coast down. What should have been startling to you is how short the rotational turn down was. It lasts like that, and the thing comes to a stop. Yet he had to stop the wheelchair in the straight coast down test. Wheelchairs are unbelievably good machines in going straight. They're really engineered nicely to go straight because there's no scrub. So let's take one chair okay, and configure it in two different ways. So we're going to take this tie light chair that came out of the box at 12.1 kg, and we're going to test it at that and the same mass as the tracer, 17.6 kg. And we're going to use the out-of-the-box tie light weight distribution and the out-of-the-box tracer weight distribution. So we have two masses and two mass distributions. Same chair, right? So we have the same frame, same bearings, we have the same wheels. We're just loading it in different ways. Okay? This is what you already know, okay? You've already been told many a time, including by my advisor, because he published on this, that when you put more weight on the drive wheels, you get less friction, okay? This is deceleration, right? So the greater the deceleration, the more friction you have, right? So this is 70% of the drive wheels. This is 55% of the drive wheels. What's interesting is there's really not much difference between the mass of the chairs in terms of rolling resistance in this case, right? You can see they're very close together. These masses are different. These masses are different. But this and this is weight distribution, okay? You put more weight on the drive wheels, you get less rolling resistance, chair goes farther. This is turning. Turning's a little different. Now what you see is the more mass on the drive wheels has a much greater effect on rolling resistance than less weight on the drive wheels. Now remember what we said. Into a turn, the casters align to the radius of curvature, so they don't swivel anymore. The tires scrub all the time. And in this case, the more you overload that, the greater your scrub and the greater the energy loss. Now granted, this is a huge difference, right? It's 55% and 80%. And we'll get into this a little bit much in more detail. But this might not have been as intuitive as one might expect until you sort of look at that free body diagram and say, okay, I can say it makes sense now. That's cool. Now, let's look at just two chairs, okay? Because chairs are different other than tires, right? So if we take this tie light and this tracer, right, and we have different, masses, and we have different wheels, we have different bearings, we have different frames. These are as different as two chairs can be, right? You can start taking a look, right? So here's straight. Straight, it's not even close, right? There's 110% difference between the tie light and the tracer. The tracer does not roll nearly as far. Now look at turning. That's a counterintuitive result. That in fact, in a zero radius turn on tile, the tracer has less frictional energy loss than the tie light. If you go on carpet, you start to see differences because carpet is a higher energy loss environment, right? So it starts to dominate the system, okay? And dominating the system changes the impact of the tires, but you can still see going straight, the tie light is a better, less energy loss chair, but in turning, you still see now a 28% difference because of the interaction between the mass of the drive wheels, the tires themselves, the profile of those tires, compared to what you see in a solid tire, okay? But energy loss isn't propulsion. It's just a way to measure resistive energy loss. And it's important, and I think we started there, right? Because we need to characterize what happens to the system itself. And measuring friction, measuring energy loss is the way to do that. But the trick is measuring propulsion torque when wheeling gets easier, because that starts to take it home a little bit. So think about this. I said that you have tons of decisions to make that impact friction and inertia. And these are a few of them, okay? You choose a frame, right? A frame has inertia. That inertia may be embodied by mass. If it has different mass, you're going to change the friction of the system because the mass is different. You're also going to maybe expose the user to vibratory energy losses or skew losses due to the frame decisions that you make, okay? You're also going to choose drive wheels. Drive wheels have mass, and they also have rotational inertia. Casters have diameters, which change the rotational inertia, right? They also have friction and scrub when they swivel, as well as rolling resistance when they roll. And tires in your drive wheels have friction because of the interaction with the surfaces. You're also choosing axle position. As we know, axle position affects the turning inertia, how hard it is to turn, and it also affects friction, of course, because it changes the weight distributions on the wheels, and the weight distribution of wheels measures friction. This is what you do every day. And I advocate for you just at least to think about the power of designing a chair, because nothing's going to be perfect. And Steve Mitchell said something great yesterday. He highlighted usability standards, and it uses contextual use, right? And that's your charge, right? What's the context of use, and how am I going to design something that meets that context of use, knowing nothing's perfect, nothing. So, how do these things affect effort? So we built a robot. And the robot's sort of this mass, and this mass is variable, but we have a mass distribution that matches body segment parameters, right? So you want a certain amount of mass in the torso, you want a certain amount of mass on the legs, you want some mass in the pelvis and the thighs, and you distribute that mass because you want to match a human subject. And we've configured it to a 100 kg person and a 90 kg person on the floor. And then you sort of have motor controllers. You have to run a program to control everything. And then you have these DC motors and drive wheel assemblies that drive the drive wheels. And we use current sensors to measure the torque of the system, and wheel encoders as well. Why we did this is because we wanted to go beyond asking the question, does a difference exist? Because as engineers, we know if we change friction and inertia, something's going to change. We wanted to ask, when does a difference present? And that's a tougher question. And that is why you start with a robot before you start using people. Because people can't answer that question. We're too variable, okay? We're nothing alike. And I think people rightly ask, well, can you really test wheelchairs without humans? Well, let's see what other devices we test without humans before we test them on humans. Bobsleds, right? Prosthetic ankles, Gore-Tex jackets, bicycles. It goes on and on. This is what we do, right? Except in this industry. You know, in this industry we don't, but somehow bobsleds, you know, can. So that's what we do, and this is what it looks like. So this is a straight maneuver. What you see in the graphs are the velocity profiles, and you see a lot of noise until it gets going, and then the noise goes away. And you can see, you know, what you're doing is driving the left and the drive wheel about the same speed. And what this is accelerating the chair in about 2.5 seconds to 1 meter per second, okay? And then you do a fixed wheel turn. And if you want, you can change speeds in the middle of the profile. But these are very simple trapezoidal profiles. So it's highly repeatable. And that's what you want to do. That's the only benefit of this is it's repeatable. It's very precise and very repeatable. And you can see it starts slow and then speeds up, okay? So I want to show you at least the straight again, because I want to give you an idea of how fast we accelerate, okay? So we're accelerating this in 2.5 seconds to 1 meter per second. And it's good to sort of just see this because we talk a lot about acceleration. And same with the fixed wheel turns, is how fast do we start? Because that dictates everything, right? You have to, remember, you're imparting energy into the system. We covered that, right? And so when we accelerate this thing, you can see how fast we're going. It's not overly bad. Obviously, if you go too fast, it starts sliding on the floor and stuff, and it's crappy data. Okay. So let's look at the first thing you do. You see this trapezoid over there? That trapezoid is the velocity profile. Okay. And it's kind of important because it harkens back to what we talked about. When you accelerate something, you have to overcome inertia and you're overcoming friction. Once you get to steady state speed, you're not overcoming inertia anymore if you're going straight. You're just overcoming friction. And then when you slow down, you have to overcome inertia, and friction's helping you, right? Braking is over 100% efficient because you don't have to do anything and you can stop, right? So we're only interested in the first two things because braking's totally efficient. So the first thing we did was do tire inflation because it changes friction without changing inertia, right? It's low-hanging fruit in the research world, and this is data you've seen, right? People have published on how much energy. They've published on deceleration, but never energy. And what you see is if you have a 75 PSI pneumatic tire and you only inflate it to 25 PSI, and it's really surprising how firm that still is, and I encourage you to try it. You get about 4.5% more work that you have to do if you go straight, okay? That's really not that much. That's a pretty good deal. Until you don't want to go straight anymore. And now you're hosing yourself, right? Just that difference explodes to 25% more work to be done in turning with an underinflated tire. Remember, now the friction is sort of rearing its ugly head. Okay. Well, let's look at just accelerating a chair straight, okay? So this is force. I'm only going to do 2 force slides because then I have to go to torque, and I'm doing force because I'm in the United States, and people will have a cow if I do Newton meters all the time. And plus, I did this at Shepherd Center, and I'm scared of them, so I wanted to do it in force, okay? So this is accelerating a chair at 2 different masses at 2 different weight distributions, right? We have a tie light out of a box, and then we have the tie light configured as a tracer out of the box, and we have 2 masses and 2 mass distributions, okay? And now you start looking at this thing, and what do you see? What do you see is that when you accelerate a greater mass, you take more effort. This is greater mass than that. That's a greater mass than that. When you look at mass distribution, you don't see as much of a difference. But then you see this combination of more mass and a different weight distribution start to rear its ugly head. It starts to get an outlier a little bit, okay? So this, remember, is acceleration, okay? And this is what you're applying, right? 8 pounds of force to do this turn, 7.6 pounds of force to do this turn. Now let's see about going in steady state. After you get to your speed, look at how much the force plummets, okay? The upper arm weighs about 8 pounds. The force here is about 2 pounds. So once you get going, it doesn't take nearly the effort to keep going. And if you are grade 3 or plus in raising your arm, you could probably propel a chair straight down a tile hallway after you get going. You also see very little difference between these things in steady state speed. But this is what dominates research, right? Steady state velocity. It's not that sensitive to change, and that's why we haven't made definitive conclusions about propulsion torque, because we're hosing ourselves, okay? Here's carpet. So carpet, the torque goes up, right? Now you're talking about almost 10 pounds of force to accelerate this chair, right? And once again, the greater mass takes more effort to accelerate than less mass, okay? And then once you're in steady state speed, it's not quite twice, but it's getting close to twice that force required to keep that steady state speed. And now you can see the differences in mass is not that much, but you're starting to see a little bit of difference in mass distribution, okay? So once again, what do you know? You know some things are pretty intuitive, that carpet is harder to push on. You might not have known how much, and clearly the amount of force it takes to accelerate a chair on carpet is really pronounced. Okay? Now in turning, okay, everything gets screwed up. The interesting thing about turning is it pretty much doesn't matter, right? You're on carpet, everything sucks, okay, when you turn. And your weight and your weight distribution don't have nearly the difference. Look at this. Remember, these are two different masses. These are 5.5 kg difference. Who has any idea how much that is in pounds? What'd you say? 12? Where'd you go to school? What country? What country did you go to school? That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. You're an anomaly. I think that's a good thing to be an anomaly. You know? Yeah, that's a lot. 12 pounds is non-trivial, right? 5.5 kg. And now you see sort of this turning force on tile, much greater when you start adding in all the baggage associated with mass distribution, okay? And then on carpet, everything equals out a bit. You know, the differences in chairs in high friction situations are less different, okay? What if you just test the same chairs configured with the same weight? Is there a difference between sort of the bearings and the wheels and all this stuff if we configured the tie light to weigh the same with the same mass distribution as the tracer, okay? It's kind of interesting. So even with that, right, you have a difference in these chairs. This is what y'all sort of always know, is this is a better chair. And it is a better chair. It's not the mass of the chair. It's more than just the mass of the chair. It's a better chair, okay? That's an important thing to be able to conclude, okay? That even though it looks like a chair, it might be different color, you can't just say, oh, it's because of this 12-pound difference. It's more. Something else is going on that we need to figure out. What makes this quality and going straight, okay? So, if you look at the straight trajectory on tile and carpet, again, you sort of see the tie light is less effortful regardless of a mass and weight distribution, okay? And then you see when you're on carpet, though, it all goes away because you have this high friction system and the benefit of the tie light just doesn't sort of present in nearly the same manner because of this high friction situation, even though it's a very common. It's carpet not that's dissimilar than this. It's industrial type low pile carpet, okay? However, then you start turning, okay? And now you say, this is odd. It takes less torque to turn a tie light than it does, it takes less torque to turn a tracer than a tie light and a zero turn, okay? This is counterintuitive, okay? And this is my hypothesis. 1 3/8-inch tires that have some tread are designed to go indoors and outdoors on hard surfaces and soft surfaces in the wet and the dry climate. It's trying to be a general, everyday, all-place tire. That does not mean it's optimized for indoors. These solid trapezoidal tires are optimized for indoors. And that is why you have to know the context of use. There's no shame in giving somebody a solid trapezoidal profile tire if they're going to live in a linoleum world. That might be the best choice for them. And you know, there's a lot of people that live in linoleum worlds, right? And teasing that out and then trying to figure out, well, can we make a better tire that doesn't hurt us as much indoors but still has the benefit outdoors? That's a laudable goal, right? But you're asking a tire to do an extremely difficult problem, to go all surfaces and all conditions. Geez, that's impossible. Nothing does that. Nothing. So what about smaller distribution? We're going, that's 12 pounds, that's way too much, okay? So we took a Quickie GT and we did a more clinically thing. So, right, we're dealing with 2.5 kg, okay? That's 5.5 pounds for those scoring at home. And then two weight distributions at 80 and 72%, okay? Very narrower range, okay? Never a human being is going to tell the difference into the, never, okay? So this is why we have to start with this geeky mechanical thing and then figure out where to go, okay? So here's acceleration torque, okay? Acceleration torque in Newton meters. You have a these are different, these are the same mass here, right? Different weight distributions, they're nearly identical, and then you're adding 2.5 kg. And once again, you know, this sort of combination of adding mass and changing weight distribution starts to conspire in combination, not alone, but in combination to be more effortful, okay? And then steady state torque, everything flows down, right? You got 17 Newton meters here, and you're talking about 3.5 Newton meters there. That's a huge difference, right? In accelerating. Again, now you're starting to see, once you start going straight, now the masses aren't that different. The weight distributions sort of are showing a little bit different rise, okay? So the 80% requires about 4.5% less torque, right? So we're trying to tease this out and going straight, okay? But then you have to cross this with turning, right? Nothing comes for free. Everything's a trade-off or a compromise. And you can see an acceleration, still impacted by mass, and the weight distribution has a bigger effect than the overall 2.5 kg. But then you're starting to look at the higher friction situation. This is a fixed wheel turn right here, right? The higher friction at 80% starts to exert influence, and you get more efforts required because you've overloaded the rear wheels, okay? Very precise type of measurements that we can use. So what does this mean, okay? What are you going to do with this information? You're going to go back and say, this guy annoyed me in the morning and annoyed me after lunch, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. So the first thing is everybody can push a chair on constant speed and tile, okay? Get over it. If they can't do that, put them in a power chair, okay? It's not that hard, okay? Now, what kind of material do you have in your hospitals? Oh, tile. How are your hallways? They're straight. So that might not be your best bet, right? Your best bet isn't, hey, can you wheel straight down the thing? Let me see how you go. They can all do that. So to evaluate somebody, make them change their momentum. They need to go through starts, stops, and turns, and if any case, try to get them on carpet and see if they can do turns. Now you've properly evaluated them. Based on their use, you can easily limit this to 1 to 2 minutes and give pretty good confidence that you've given them a good representation, because not everybody's going to push for 2 minutes, okay? But get them to change momentum, start, stops, and turns on different surfaces. If you want to reduce instantaneous stress on the shoulder, accelerate more slowly, okay? I don't know how many of you sprint to a steady state walking speed, but you're exerting more force than if you just accelerated slowly. And that's the same with wheelchair users. I see more wheelchair users sprint to steady state than I see walkers sprint to walking. That's just elevating. It's 3 to 4 times. It's not trivial, okay? The data reflects differences in propulsion torque due to changes in friction and inertia, and you have a say in both, okay? However, this data is not meant to address the biomechanics of the propulsion stroke, and you just have a say in that as well, okay? Good biomechanics is based on a well-fit chair, okay? And you could put somebody in the best chair, and if they're not fit to it, you might as well put them in a less good chair that they are fit to. That's where biomechanics meet mechanics, okay? You have to pay equal attention to not only the equipment, but to the fit of it, okay? Both inertia and friction are reflective of its mass and mass distribution, okay? But the user's everything. You know, I'm sick and tired of hearing this, oh, I don't want this, it adds a pound. You know, well, put down the Snickers. You know, and then we'll talk. You know, the occupied mass difference of a tracer and a tie light out of the box is only about 5% in these studies. And it was 2.5%, you know, with the lesser thing. That's really not that much. You know, we deal with body mass in a lot of our situations, right? And there's a lot of reasons to reduce body mass, but it's no reason not to get wheel locks if you need wheel locks. Okay. What can we do with this? Okay. I maintain this is how you start to inform human subject trials. Because if we can measure something with high precision using a machine, then we can figure out where the clinically meaningful differences are to human beings. If we don't know that, then we might be hosing ourselves and testing something that has no difference or no appreciable difference mechanically. And that's why you have to know the mechanical differences before you can study the clinically meaningful differences. I can't believe we categorize chairs by rectilinear inertia. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And that's what we do. And we use it as some kind of threshold of goodness. You know, oh, you're 29.5 pounds, you're good. Oh, you're 30.5 pounds, you're evil. Have you ever noticed that's why there are no 31-pound chairs? Because, you know, there's a cost difference to it. Do you really think they're that different? This allows us to categorize chairs by performance because we're using mass as a measure of performance and it doesn't reflect performance. So let's do it well. We need to figure out how to do slalom maneuvers to deal with caster scrub. And we actually almost have that done. That's a controls problem, right? Because doing slalom is going to rotate the casters. It's a little bit problematic because if you saw, every one of those tests started and stopped at the same place. Well, when you start doing slalom maneuvers, they're going to start and stop at different places. And that's tougher to characterize the work because that, you know, work is tied to an effort in the task effort, and our tasks are going to change. But we're figuring it out, and I hope maybe next year, if I'm lucky enough, and y'all forget about how bad this one went, I'll be invited back. I think we need to study how wheelchairs change in energy loss after use, because that's how I think quality is going to be determined. I think our chairs out of the box are pretty good. I don't think they're equally good after a year. But they have to last 60 months. So we can measure the energy loss out of the box and then the energy loss after simulated use of 12 and 24 and 36 months, and then say, you know, you're not good enough. I'm going to pay you less. Or, you know, you rock after 60 months. I'm going to pay you more. We can evaluate different configurations and not tell you if a different exists. We can empower you with decision of when the difference exists. Then you can make the decision, and the user can make the decision to say, you know, I do need these Spinergy wheels because they give me performance under this context of use. Or, you know, I really don't need them because I'm never going to gain that benefit. We don't know that now, right? We convince ourselves that folding frame chairs have some kind of energy loss that rigid frame chairs don't have. Well, that's not true for all movements. I guarantee you. That vibratory energy loss isn't there when you're going slow on carpet. I'm sorry, it's just not. But when does it present? Okay, where is it the difference gonna show? It's gonna show, but we need to know where. Same with caster diameter and width, same with tire type. Wouldn't it be cool to be able to say, hey, based on your use, these are the 3 tires you should choose from. So, while acknowledging bias, flat out bias, because I think this is kind of cool, and I learned a boatload when I was doing this, and I was surprised at the results. And I don't like being told that, no one likes being told they're dense, you know, and nobody wants to get a D. So I maintain this reviewer spoke too soon, because I think it's dangerous to think you do know something intuitively when it's really complex. And unfortunately, I got the one reviewer, I got Sheldon Cooper, who, knows everything about physics. He's a character on an American TV show, but that's not important now. Yeah. Much of this work was funded by NIDR. So from 1976 to 2013, NIDR funded a rehab engineering center on wheel mobility. They quit funding that. And we're all to blame for that. But I need to give props to my project officer, Tom Korfman. This is a hard project. This took a lot longer because it's tough. The hardware is not all that tough. The control systems and the measurements are a little bit difficult. And he stuck with it. I would go to him and say, this is what we've done, this is what we have to do. And he said, I think you can pull this off. And not every project officer would do that. And he did, and I owe him for that. And obviously I work with some, I'm at Georgia Tech, and I'm way down the curve of intellect there. These guys are pretty good. And I worked with some great engineers, some great students. Morris is still with me, and Ray Lynn is still with me. And Howard, damn him, works in Connecticut designing propellers for submarines. Yeah. Any questions? Good. Anybody want to get a Guinness? Yeah. You can grab me if you have a question. You don't have to ask a question in public. Oh, okay. Well, thanks, Gene. That's nice, Gene. Thanks. Yeah.
So I know you explained how there's infinite number of turns and only one choice of not turn radius.
Yeah.
But your choice of blocking the tire meant that tire was skidding all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So the question is really, why do we choose a fixed wheel turn? Okay, so you have to constrain motion. And so if you're going to measure coast down in a turn, you have a few options. Okay, one option is to tether it, right? A merry-go-round does that. So you sort of tether it and you go around. And then you have that force because you're controlling the side slips, okay? And so that's an external force, okay? Another way is to lock the casters in a turn. The problem with that is they have to be locked at different angles of swivel because the radius of curvature is different. And that gets complex, and it puts, unless you nail it, you're screwing yourself, in other words. We chose only internal forces, okay, because the system is an internal force by the brake without external forces. And I don't know if that was necessarily a right or wrong decision. We viewed it as a trade-off. I think ultimately, certainly in the robot, we do many different radius of turns. I was just trying to have a parallel between the coast down and the robot. But you're absolutely right. One's not rolling, but it's scrubbing, and the other one's scrubbing. But that's really what we wanted to study. Scrubbing is an understudied mechanism because it's very difficult. And cars scrub that side slip forces, but it's such a different situation when you're powering the wheels than when you're not. But you're absolutely right. This was a highly tight turn. Only one's rolling, one's scrubbing. But it does differentiate differences, and it sets us up to start increasing the radius. And of course, as researchers know, there's a limit to that. How big a radius can you go? And will they let us use the basketball court? And carpet it. Stuff like that. But that's a fair question. Absolutely. It was a very tight turn, but people do tight turns. Yeah. Yeah. No.
Tracer and the tie light to be able to rule out whether it really was the pyramidal-shaped tire.
Yeah. So the question is, why don't you start mixing up and matching stuff, right? So you can put, one wheel on this chair and this wheel on that chair, right? And we've done that, actually. We measured, we did exactly that. We put the pneumatic tire on the tracer, And we just finished testing 3 drive wheels. So we wanted to test multiple drive wheels on a thing. The trouble becomes with casters because the forks are incompatible. And so you don't have free will with the casters. And that's part of the problem of having a nice interchange of connectivity to tease it out. But the other side of this that I didn't go over because y'all would have killed me is we're building a dynamic model of inertia and frictional energy loss that's just all put all this together. And so then you do parameter sensitivity and stuff. And I'll never speak of that again. But that's a good question. And the problem is, this is what you want to do, right? And this is how much funding you have. You know, yeah.
So one of the things I see all the time, and I feel it myself, is when the center of gravity is as far forward as I can tolerate, or the user can, that doing a turn in place right over the center seems to be much easier in that chair with the center of gravity forward than in something like a tracer. Mm-hmm. But is that still what you would consider, is that considered a turn in what you're doing, where you're just spinning around the center and you don't have any,
translation.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, so your question seems to be in a 0 radius turn, where you almost drive 1 wheel forward and 1 wheel back. Yeah, we do that with a robot too. It's pretty easy, of course. And so that's really trying to drive your wheels in a force couple around this sort of rotational thing. That's the easiest. And you're absolutely right. That's because your center of mass is moving less than when you're doing a 0 radius turn and every other radius of turn. And because your center of mass is not moving, translating as much, it's easier for you to do. So that's absolutely the most lowest effort way to turn, is 1 wheel forward and 1 back, and turning on that base of support. Your intuition is absolutely right.
On that, at least when I play around in my shop in a wheelchair, it seems like a lot of the turning time I spend is like spinning to change directions from one spot. But I didn't see, was that something that you did, any checking on how much of movement was that kind of a turn?
Yeah, that's a good question. It gets back to the definition of a bout. So what he's asking is sort of saying, hey, when I'm sort of here, I might just turn this way and turn that way and turn this way. And is that a bout? And the answer is no, because we defined a bout as the transition between 2 activities. So we had a minimum distance, right, within a minimum amount of time, okay? And it was basically, you had to do about a meter, right, which is about a wheel revolution. Right? No, it's 2 meters. So you had to go, I think, 2 meters within 15 seconds in order to consider it a bout, because we also wanted to we had a max and a min, right? Because we also wanted to not count pauses as stops. So, if you're just going and you pause and let somebody go and then you go again, that's not exactly a stop. It's kind of funny, when you test wheelchairs, measuring a stop in a manual chair is exceedingly hard if you're using an accelerometer. Measuring in a power chair is exceedingly easy with an accelerometer, because the power chair has a requirement that a lock kicks in. And manual users will creep, and just creep at this slow speed, and it drives you crazy when you're looking at it in MATLAB, And so we did discount that. So if you're just working in your space, it was not a bout. Yes, I think that's the only way to measure it. I think you get a new chair, you measure it. The easiest way, of course, would be to simulate the use, right? You do it, and every wheelchair manufacturer has the merry-go-round, right? You test the chair, send it to the merry-go-round, and then test the chair again. The cooler way to do it, of course, would be, oh, your chair's delivered today. Let's put the robot in it and test it, and can you come back in 6 months? Wouldn't that be cool? But I think that's the only way to do it, because I think it's such a complex thing to sort of figure out not only tire wear, but bearing wear and frame flexion and loosening the nuts and all that you need a fairly precise measurement of torque. I don't think a human being could do it at all. So yeah, I think that would be a neat, neat thing to study.
Is it robust enough to do that?
Robust enough. It's precise enough.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah, it's precise.
That ability to do it 30 times precise.
Yeah. Your problem, of course, the question is it precise enough, right? And that's tough. If you do a test today and you do it again, you know, in 6 months and nothing changed, you get the same answer. And one of the challenges is getting this robot in the same position, right? But we know that because we measure all the inertias of the wheel, of the system. So we can put the amps in and say, oh, the rotational inertia or the center of mass is not in the same place. Let's lift it up and move it. And so that's exactly what we do. So we have some quality control of the mass of the system on the seat, but the measurement of torque is really highly precise.
So you're precise enough to tell you're sitting in an inch or two different spots?
Oh, yeah. So, well, not me, but it's a robot, yeah. Yeah, so we measure inertia. It's a big platform. It's a big disc, and you wheel onto it, and it has 3 load cells. And you can measure precisely your center of mass in that plane, right? We don't measure height. And then we process it. So it's just a little spring, and it's just a damped harmonic, so you just process it, and that frequency is tied to the moment of inertia. And it's a pretty simple system. It's not that hard to make, but it's highly precise, and I think it certainly helps us test things over time.
Okay. One last question.
Oh.
Do you foresee any differences when you make your model a little more sophisticated when you have the center of gravity changing throughout the push and the stroke, where your
Yeah.
robot's just static?
No, that was a tough design decision we made because, and we talked about that. My answer to the team was, I think it's better to crawl before we walk, and you're asking us to run. And they fought me on it, but the person who holds the wallet gets to make the final decision. That's what I tell my kids all the time. But I think you're absolutely right. If you think about it, it wouldn't be that hard to control because you have total control of the mass, right? You could rip the heart out of this thing and just move a battery, right? And that's probably what you would do, is just sort of take a battery and shift it forward. You wouldn't have to move the trunk. But what we wanted to do is make it to have the same reaction forces. And that's why the arms are up here, because it has to push against the backrest, that reaction force. If it didn't have to do that, of course, you just drive it from the side. But we wanted that loading to be representative when you're going around turns and when you're accelerating, to sort of have those reaction forces. And then the next step is, you know, a battery's just a hunk of lead, right? And then maybe we just move this battery forward with every stroke and then come back. Propulsion strokes, intermittent strokes, are something that we have done, but they're pretty problematic because you have to have freewheeling. And that freewheeling is tough as a control scheme, and it's impossible to do a turn in freewheeling unless you're braking one side. And braking is problematic with the robot because it's so efficient. It's 100% efficient, and so you're charging the battery, essentially. So all those things are in the books, but like I said, as you know better than anybody, right? You want to do this, and you have funding for that.
Thank you, Dr.
So